Every great power rivalry today, US-China decoupling, AI labs, military tech, runs through basically one company, TSMC. The iPhone alone contains over 30 chips. A model electric vehicle now uses as many as 3,000 chips each. Semiconductors are the backbone of global power. But here's what almost nobody talks about. What if I told you that Singapore came closer to creating our own TSMC than most people realize? We created Chartered Semiconductors in the exact same year that TSMC was founded, which was 1987. And yet, today, Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Singapore produces none, even as we account for 10% of all the chips produced worldwide. Why? How did a country that built Chartered Semiconductors, TSMC's early peer, end up watching TSMC become an empire worth over $1 trillion, while our national champion vanished in a merger? This is a story most Singaporeans have never been told. How Singapore nearly created its own TSMC, why the plan derailed, could we have won, and what it reveals about our entire approach to risk, strategy, and national champions. Before we go further, welcome to What Makes a Country. I'm Tian Chong, your host, and on this channel, we uncover the hidden architecture behind successful countries. Our focus is on the policies, institutions, and businesses that create lasting, thriving societies. So if this is up your alley, please subscribe. Singapore's semiconductor journey didn't begin with a master plan. It began with a simple act of survival. In 1965, Singapore has just become independent and was grappling with sky-high unemployment close to 9%. The government is racing against time to create jobs before social unrest sets in. The Economic Development Board, or better known as the EDB, had only been created a few years earlier, in 1961. Its mission then was simply to convince foreign companies that Singapore was even worth a look. But after independence, that mission became existential. If Singapore didn't industrialize fast, it wouldn't survive. And among the first to say yes, in 1968, was National Semiconductor. Texas Instruments followed a year after. They were assembly and test lines, far from the technological frontier, but they gave Singapore something priceless, a foothold into the semiconductor world. As I covered in an earlier video, these early wins weren't luck. They were the result of an all-out effort by the EDB. After independence, Singapore had committed to an export-led strategy, attract multinational manufacturers, give them subsidized land, strip away red tape, and build a workforce disciplined enough to hit the quality standards of the best factories in the world. For 2 decades, the strategy worked. Singapore industrialized faster than anyone expected. But by the mid-1980s, the momentum started to crack. In 1985, Singapore was hit by its first recession that the rest of the world didn't experience. Economists later call it a homegrown recession. Wages had risen too quickly. Costs for companies were out of sync with Singapore workers' productivity. Factories began relocating. Suddenly, industrialization, the engine that had powered Singapore's rise, no longer looked secure. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Philip Yeo entered the picture. Yeo had been Dr. Goh Keng Swee's right-hand man in the Ministry of Defence. In 1986, he was moved to the EDB as chairman, and he brought with him a radically different philosophy. To him, every industry had a lifespan, 10 to 15 years, if you were lucky. These drives were booming in Singapore. By 1991, Singapore was producing half of the world's supply, but he knew that it wouldn't last. Singapore needed the next frontier, and one of the areas that he looked fixated on were semiconductors. Dr. John Horney, one of the members of the traitorous eight that defected from Shockley Semiconductors to build Fairchild, told Philip Yeo that Singapore should go into semiconductor manufacturing. Wafer fabs were some of the highest value, highest productivity segment in the entire semiconductor chain. That conversation planted the seed for what would become one of Singapore's most ambitious industrial gambles. In 1987, the very same year that Taiwan founded TSMC, Singapore launched its own national foundry, Chartered Semiconductor Manufacturing. It began as a division of the state-owned Singapore Technologies Group, a captive semiconductor manufacturer for 2 American companies, National and Sierra Semiconductor. But National Semiconductor will pull out just 2 years later. Chartered's ambition then had to change. After deliberation, he wanted to take on a radically new business model, the dedicated semiconductor foundry, one that TSMC had pioneered. A company that didn't design its own chips, didn't compete with its customers, and instead simply manufactured other people's designs. Today, the foundry model sounds obvious, but back then it was heresy. The industry was dominated by the belief Jerry Sanders of AMD had made famous: real men have fabs. Integrated device manufacturers, IDMs, like Intel, Motorola, Toshiba, designed their own chips and manufactured them in their own fabs. That was the natural order of things. If they ever had spare capacity in their fabs, they offered it reluctantly and only on their own terms. Outsiders got scraps, and even then, trust was almost non-existent. In an era where the circuitry of a chip revealed your deepest intellectual property, handing your blueprints to another company was reckless. Maurice Cheng at TSMC was the one who broke that logic. He introduced a radical idea, a neutral manufacturer that produced chips for everyone, while competing with no one. He compared it to publishing. You don't have to own a printing press to write a book or publish it. Someone else prints the pages and binds them into a book at a fixed price, no matter what the book is about. Beneath the analogy was a brutally simple business model. As Maurice Cheng explained in 1991, we sell wafers at a fixed price, around $800. You put what you want on the wafer, we don't care. Sell them for what you want. If we run this fab close to capacity, we can make $250, maybe $280, 35% gross margins on a good day. But this required something that industry has never done before: trust. Trust that a foundry would never steal a customer's design. Apple later learned this the hard way. Samsung manufactured its H series chips, while simultaneously producing its own smartphones to compete, eventually becoming Apple's fiercest rival. This was the uphill battle Chartered walked straight into. Finding customers in 1990 was a Herculean task. The foundry model was still unproven. Chartered was an unknown player, and the global semiconductor industry had slipped into recession. By the end of 1991, Chartered had accumulated losses of $100 million. And yet, the company didn't fold. It pushed harder. Using the technology transferred from Sierra, Chartered launched an aggressive R&D drive. In just a few years, it climbed through process nodes at remarkable speed. 1.5 micron in 1990, 1.2 a year after, 0.8 micron in 1992, and 0.6 micron in 1993. A further breakthrough came in 1994. Chartered secured a 5-year technology collaboration with Toshiba, one of the world's semiconductor giants. Toshiba agreed to transfer its advanced 0.5 micron logic process, and in return, Chartered became a guaranteed second source for Toshiba products, with Toshiba taking an equity stake in the company. With new capacity built alongside Toshiba, Chartered's revenues rose by more than 70% that year. But even this dramatic growth revealed how far behind it still was. Chartered made $285 million in revenue that year, dwarfed by UMC's $900 million and TSMC's $1.09 billion. That very same year, Chartered opened its second wafer fab. The first fab in the Science Park had already been running at full capacity for years, producing 6-inch wafers for over 50 customers worldwide. Fab 2, built on an accelerated schedule, began shipping 8-inch wafers by mid-1995, barely a year after construction began. By the end of the year, Fab 2 was already breaking even. By 1996, Chartered was racing to keep up. Fab 3 was rising in Woodlands and scheduled to open the next year, but the ground beneath the industry was shifting fast. In Taiwan, a divide was opening. TSMC's 1997 revenue had surged to nearly double UMC's, and UMC itself was already roughly twice the size of Chartered, cementing a widening distance between the two Taiwanese foundry giants and basically everyone else. Chartered had to respond, but couldn't muster enough resources to race to the leading edge by themselves. Chartered started to ink customer joint ventures. If it wanted any chance of staying in the race without too much capital, it needed anchor long-term customers who commit capacity upfront, and partners willing to share the enormous cost of building the next generation of manufacturing plants. It began shifting to a model built around customer joint ventures, shared risk, shared reward partnerships that gave the IDMs guaranteed capacity in exchange for capital, technology access, and stable demand. Fab 4 became the first major example, a joint venture with Hewlett-Packard, with Singapore's EDB as equity partner, and it gave HP a second source manufacturing base right inside Singapore. Fab 5 followed quickly after, this time with Lucent Technologies under a similar structure. By tying global giants directly into its production lines, Chartered hoped to build scale, secure revenue visibility, and climb the technology curve fast. But the way that Chartered tried to differentiate itself would soon create a trap it couldn't escape from. While TSMC and UMC built broad diversified customer bases due to their first mover advantage, PCs, consumer electronics, early fabless firms, Chartered deliberately steered towards a narrower, high-growth niche, communications. In 1997, communications made up 29% of Chartered's revenue. By 2000-2001, the figure has surged to about 50%, whereas at TSMC, the share was only 30%. Chartered thought to win a handful of big anchor customers, companies like Ericsson and Broadcom, who were riding the boom in mobile phones, cable modems, and networking equipments. Investors loved the story. Chartered went public in 1999. and it raised US $400 million, one of the largest Singapore-linked tech IPOs of that era. But the bet would soon blow up. By 2001, the dot-com bubble had burst, and nowhere did demand collapse more brutally than in communications chips. What had once been Charted's high-growth niche became its deepest vulnerability. Furthermore, its reliance on IDMs spelled further trouble. In a downturn, they behaved in the most economically rational way possible. They simply shifted production back into their own fabs. To break even, Charted needed 70% utilization. It was sitting at 50%. The deeper structural problems were becoming impossible to ignore. Charted's R&D was US $80 million, barely one-third of TSMC's. And for the first time in its history, TSMC had developed its 12-inch wafer process in-house, giving a massive cost and learning curve advantage. TSMC's technology edge was why big customers like Broadcom were sending their most advanced chips to them. Charter was only getting the simpler products in comparison. And even as Charter was fighting to stay afloat, the Singapore government, eager to build an entire semiconductor ecosystem larger than a single national champion, began hedging its bets. The state, via EDB, backed two fabs in Singapore, SSMC by TSMC and Philips, and UMCI by UMC and Infineon, which will both directly compete with Charter. The timing couldn't have been worse. By then, TSMC had already controlled 40% of the global foundry market, and the future of the industry, the fabless model, was starting to take off. Fabless companies might have only made up 7.6% of all semiconductor revenue in the year 2000, but they represented the fastest growing, most innovative driven segment. TSMC has seen this years earlier and built its entire business around serving them. Nearly half of the world's 1,300 fabless firms were sending their most advanced designs to TSMC in Hsinchu, Taiwan, and not Singapore. This was the moment when skeptics began to openly question whether Singapore's national foundry had the cash, the customers, or the technological depth to survive the next cycle. In 2002, Chartered appointed Chia Song Hui, then CFO, as president and CEO. He inherited a company in crisis. TSMC and UMC together controlled 62% of all custom-built chip sales. Chartered held just 5%. Charted's market value was 1/7 of UMC and 1/15 of TSMC. The company was losing money quarter after quarter. To stay alive, it raised $1.1 billion in new capital, with Singapore Technologies, its majority shareholder, stepping in to provide $671 million. Charter was being squeezed from both ends. At the low end, cheaper fabs in Malaysia, China and Korea were coming online. And at the high end, its process technology lagged TSMC by up to 4 quarters. So Chia bet the future of Chartered on a deep high-stakes partnership with IBM by buying into IBM's R&D engine. If Chartered couldn't close the technological gap through its own research, it would close it by licensing from someone who could. Under the deal, Chartered will adopt IBM's 90nm and later 65nm logic processors. The first payment alone was $40 million. Analysts estimated that Chartered had been 4 quarters behind TSMC at the start of 2002. With IBM's help, that gap might shrink to a matter of months. Chia later said that the IBM deal was key to Charted's return to profitability. Almost immediately, customers began calling. In 2003, both Chartered and IBM had roughly $800 million in foundry revenue, and Charted's revenue grew 50% that year. But even that was not enough. That very same year, TSMC generated $5.8 billion, nearly twice UMC's, and 7 times Chartered. It wasn't just that TSMC was larger, it was actually accelerating away. Inside Chartered, the pressure was obvious. The company moved aggressively to clean up its cost structure. It shut down Fab 1, its only 6-inch line, consolidating production into Fab 2. The plan was straightforward: shed mature nodes, concentrate on its more profitable processes, and redirect scarce capital towards China and furthering its advanced technologies that might keep the company in the race. Chartered continued to bet heavily on the relationship with IBM. In 2005, the partnership expanded to include 45nm joint development. That same year, Samsung joined IBM, Chartered and Infineon in the 65nm process alliance. But as the next few years would show, even being the club didn't guarantee survival. TSMC's biggest customers like Nvidia, Broadcom, Qualcomm were already locked into deep multi-year relationships. They weren't just buying wafers, they were tuning their design and building entire product cycles around TSMC's process technologies. The switching cost was enormous, and the trust was deeply entrenched. The entire ecosystem surrounding TSMC was compounding faster than any competitor could match. By the time the next financial crisis rolled around in 2008, Temasek was done. For nearly 2 decades, Singapore had poured massive amounts of resources into Chartered, but the numbers were moving in only one direction. As losses mounted, and the technology gap widened, Temasek began looking for an exit. Industry reports at the time suggested that they had approached Samsung, SMIC, TSMC, UMC, and several other players about a potential merger or acquisition. News of those talks leaked into the press, unnerving customers who were already uncertain about whether Chartered would survive another down cycle. Then, a buyer emerged who wanted exactly what Chartered had spent 20 years building. Global Foundries, the newly created Abu Dhabi-backed manufacturer, formed after the government acquired AMD's fabs. Abu Dhabi's sovereign fund was trying to diversify its economy away from oil and push into frontier technologies. It wanted immediate scale, a global footprint, and a shot at becoming a top-tier foundry. Chartered was the perfect fit. For Temasek, the choice was clear. By 2008, the scoreboard was undeniable. TSMC's revenue, $10.6 billion. UMC's, $2.9 billion. Chartered, just $1.7 billion. In September 2009, Temasek agreed to sell Chartered to Global Foundries for $1.8 billion, with Global Foundries also assuming $2.2 billion in debt. Singapore's attempt to build its own TSMC was folded into a larger geopolitical project half a world away. But the sale wasn't simply because Chartered was smaller. It was because the company found itself trapped inside two structural disadvantages that was almost impossible to solve. First, Chartered was stuck as a second source foundry and was never the technological leader. Its lead customers, such as Microsoft and HP, never treated it as a primary partner. They used Chartered for backup capacity and not for their most advanced chips. The joint ventures that Chartered had doubled down on with HP and Lucent also meant that it was stuck. By contrast, TSMC learned early that joint ventures created conflicts with the rest of its customer base by the late 1990s. TSMC then made a deliberate decision to buy out its JV partners because it had the in-house capacity and the technical confidence to serve everyone directly. Chartered's reliance on licensed technology removed the internal pressure to innovate. Licensing from Toshiba, then IBM, kept costs low and reduced risk. But it also guaranteed that Chartered would always be behind the frontier. And because IBM or any of Chartered's licensing partners could license the same technology to anyone, including SMIC or Samsung, Chartered's leading edge was never truly its own. Samsung, or the partners in the IBM-Chartered alliance, used IBM's IP as supplementary fuel to an enormous internal R&D engine. Funded by the company's huge DRAM profits, TSMC too started life as a second-rate technological partner behind the big IDMs, but it made a series of far-sighted, high-risk R&D investments in copper interconnects and immersion lithography that transformed it into a world-class technological powerhouse by the early 2000s. The copper interconnect story alone shows the difference in mindset. When IBM approached both TSMC and UMC to license its copper interconnect process, UMC accepted the licensing, whereas TSMC bet against it, instead pouring R&D expertise to develop their own superior technology instead. In about a year, a team of 6 elite Semiconductor TSMC R&D scientists led the development of their own process node. IBM's technology later underperformed commercially, slowing down UMC, while TSMC's internally developed node became a breakthrough. TSMC's 130nm launch skyrocketed its technological credibility, won plaudits from the Taiwanese government, and you can see that difference directly in the financials. Gross margins is a true indicator of how special your product is and how much customers are willing to pay for it. In the years leading up to the sale, Chartered's gross margins fluctuated around 10 to 20+%. And during that same period, TSMC's gross margins were around 40%. This meant that Chartered was being squeezed from both ends. At the top end, Chartered could not challenge the technological lead of frontier foundries like TSMC. And at the bottom, cheaper foundries were coming online. For instance, SMIC, backed by the Chinese state, could produce the same IBM-derived technology at lower prices, with guaranteed domestic demand as the state steered local firms towards its own foundry. This meant that the mid-market that Chartered occupied became structurally more and more unprofitable over time. Second, Singapore never built the ecosystem that Taiwan did. Chartered was also fighting the absence of an entire supporting ecosystem. Chartered needed fabless design companies, ODMs and EMS providers like Foxconn, the downstream consumers of wafers who feed constant volume into a foundry, but Singapore never developed a critical mass of them. For instance, in IC design, Taiwan in 1994 had about 4% of the market share in the global fabless market, but this quickly reached 10% by 2002 and about 18% by 2015. And this was all spearheaded
by leading fabless companies like VIA and MediaTek.
And this mattered more than most people realize. Every successful fabless company feeds its most advanced designs into the foundry sitting right next door. That proximity creates a self-reinforcing loop, especially when digital design tools weren't that advanced yet. The more fabless firms that Taiwan produced, the more advanced and experimental designs flowed into TSMC. That meant more wafer volume, a steeper learning curve, and more cash that TSMC could pour straight back into R&D. Each cycle made the next one better and faster. More design houses led to better technology, which put in even more design houses. It was a flywheel that fed on itself, and TSMC was at the center of it, whereas Chartered never had the engine behind it. Ultimately, Chartered never truly caught up with its Korean and Taiwanese peers because Singapore entered the race significantly later. Korea had already begun promoting semiconductors through its chaebol system in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Taiwan built its foundation in the mid-1970s with state-funded research institutes like ITRI, long before TSMC existed. Singapore was the last to arrive, only venturing into semiconductors with its own national player in the mid-1980s. So what are the takeaways? First, the limits of capital. Some races can't be simply won with money alone. Even if Singapore had poured in far more capital, it's debatable whether we could have even beaten TSMC. This industry isn't just expensive, it's astronomically so.
Back in the 1980s, a bleeding edge fab cost around $40 to $50 million.
Today, a leading edge fab costs well over $20 billion to build, and just as much to operate over the next 10 years. Yes, pouring large amounts of capital might have worked in the early days of the foundry business, but even then, it would have required extraordinary conviction to back a new, unproven business model with that level of spending, years before the world understood how important semiconductors would become or how the foundry model actually worked. And with each node, physics gets harder, the equipment gets costlier, and you need to aggregate more and more demand from global customers to justify the next technological leap. That's why, at the very frontier, there's effectively only room for only one or two players in the world. Everyone else ends up effectively competing for scraps. Even Samsung, one of the two giants, funds its leading-edge effort through memory chip profits, not simply through its logic foundry business. Without that cross-subsidy, Samsung's foundry economics wouldn't make sense. Even Intel, once the undisputed king, struggled to keep pace. And the fact that Abu Dhabi, with all its oil wealth and all its national technology ambitions riding on global foundries, still considered divesting the company, speaks volumes about how brutally hard it is to stay in this game. The truth is that until AI came along and supercharged demand, it was getting harder and harder for anyone to economically justify pushing to the next generation of node. Second, how could we have cultivated our own ecosystem and cluster of companies? Temasek never had a DNA to be an incubator of new industries. It was initially built as a holding company and has evolved to become an asset manager. When you manage hundreds of billions of dollars, a struggling $2 billion company becomes just 1 to 2% of your portfolio. The instinct is to protect the portfolio, not double down on a single moonshot. Contrast that with Taiwan. Taiwan created ITRI, a state-funded research institute whose mission was precisely to spin companies out, to transfer those technology into private hands. From 1976 to 1980, ITRI spent about $120 million to acquire IC design and manufacturing technologies from abroad. Since its founding, it has spun off more than 160 companies, with TSMC and UMC being its most famous, but others include Vanguard International, Phison Electronics, and Syntec, one of the first design houses. By the end of the 1980s, ITRI was a 6,000-person research operation with an operating budget exceeding $1 billion. Furthermore, Singapore never viewed semiconductors as central to its national strategy. Think about how Temasek stepped in to rescue Singapore Airlines during the recent COVID pandemic. Not simply out of sentiment, but because preserving capacity was existential to Singapore's status as an air hub. If we lost pilots, engineers, cabin crew staff, or aircraft routes, rebuilding them might take years. When the world reopened, SIA roared back with record profits because the state kept investing when everyone else was cutting. Semiconductors work about the same way. They are brutally cyclical. Only players with deep financial backing who keeps investing during downturns stay at the frontier. And nothing illustrates this better than what happened at TSMC in 2008. Maurice Cheng's handpicked successor had taken over as CEO. But as the global financial crisis hit, he made what seemed like a rational move. Cost discipline. He put engineers on performance reviews to trim the workforce and streamline operation. At the same time, TSMC stumbled on its 40nm rollout, the most important node at the time. For most companies, this would have been normal reactions to a downturn. But Maurice Cheng knew that the semiconductor industry doesn't forgive hesitation. If you cut talent today, you might save a little money, but you might lose your future. He was aware that it takes 6 months to remove people, another 6 months to train their replacements, and by the time that they hit their stride, the market cycle would have already turned. The competitors who kept investing through the winter pull irreversibly ahead. If you let the wave pass you, there's a chance you might never catch it again. So Chang returned as CEO, he overthrew Tsai and reversed the cuts. And this brings me to what Singapore lacked. If Singapore wants to build its own technological champions, we need a second institution alongside Temasek. And I'm not the only one who thinks this way. In my conversation with Inderjit Singh, the founder of UTech, the $2 billion chip giant, and former MP of 20 years, he mentioned exactly this.
They are looking at financial parameters rather than long-term strategic goals. To create a future multinational may need a 10 to 15 years horizon. So for many years in Parliament, I talked about Temasek too. I said Temasek now has become like a GIC.
Yeah.
It's okay. I mean, that's a government strategy. But now we need one more player that's independent of Temasek to be investing in the future generation. We never did it. What the government did was put funds under Temasek. So when the parent is a financial player, then it's a different thing. That's why I wanted a separate entity that managed by a different group of people, not influenced, and they are allowed to take risks. If they had done that, I think maybe it would have been a bit different.
I'll be posting the full interview with him soon, so keep an eye out. One whose sole mandate is to incubate domestic companies, acquire and transfer technology, take decade-long bets, and build clusters, the exact role that E3 played for Taiwan. Because in today's geopolitical environment, relying purely on foreign MNCs is no longer enough. Their loyalties will always tilt towards their home governments. Without our own companies, we will always be playing catch-up in frontier industries. If Singapore truly wants to avoid being a spectator in the next technological era, we need to build a critical mass of local firms. Third, Singapore didn't build the risk-taking culture that frontier industries demand. One of the most misunderstood parts of Taiwan's rise is that it didn't begin with TSMC or UMC, it began with other failures. Taiwan tried twice before, Fine Products Microelectronics and Taiwan Micro Devices Corporation, both high-profile attempts which collapsed. But these failures didn't shrink political space to maneuver. They convinced the government that success in semiconductors required repeated attempts, not a perfect first try. When UMC finally proved that Taiwan could compete, it unlocked the confidence for a second spin-out, TSMC. Singapore, in contrast, looked for a home run on the very first swing. And when Chartered struggled, we never took a second shot. Granted, by then the train had probably already left the station, and TSMC's lead was entrenched, but the broader pattern holds. Because this is the real test of national strategy. Can a country stomach repeated technical failures long enough to produce a champion? Taiwan's real engine wasn't just institutional risk appetite, it was talent density, spearheaded largely by a single man. Maurice Cheng has often said that his most important backer was Economics Minister K.T. Lee, a rare political figure willing to bet on long-shot technology. The Taiwanese government's actual contributions to TSMC were surprisingly modest. 1. A financial investment of about $500 million Taiwan dollars, and 2. A transfer of 100 to 120 engineers from E3. In fact, when TSMC went public in the early 1990s, the government sold its shares so aggressively that Maurice Cheng had to personally ask them to stop. What truly mattered was what Taiwan did in parallel. It built a dense, self-reinforcing talent cluster. Taiwan deliberately brought back engineers from Bell Labs, IBM, Intel, Motorola, people who had worked at the absolute frontier of device physics and manufacturing. By 1988, more than half the companies in Hsinchu Science Park were founded by overseas returnees. Initially, there were only 39 returnees in 1985, but by 2003, it had 4,340 returnees who have founded 119 companies. That is what a compounding ecosystem looks like. At the leading edge, talent decides everything. The margins between success and failure are razor thin. A single exceptional engineer can potentially shift global competitive dynamics. Liang Mong Song is the most famous example. Passed over for the top R&D job at TSMC, he defected to Samsung and helped them catch up at 14 nanometers. It was a seismic moment. Samsung broke TSMC's near-complete monopoly in advanced logic, and several major customers defected. This is the level of talent density that frontier industries run on. When Singapore outsourced its R&D to IBM, Toshiba, and others, we lowered technological risk, but we also ensured that the hardest problems, the physics-defying breakthroughs, were solved elsewhere. And when the frontier work happens elsewhere, the talent cluster also happens elsewhere, not here. Without the talent density, it becomes almost impossible to build the kind of compounding ecosystem that produces a TSMC or a Samsung. And that's why Singapore cannot afford to step back from attempting frontier problems. Singapore was built on improbable bets. For instance, no one would imagine that one of the world's best airlines would emerge from a tiny island like ours. The danger isn't that we fail, it's that we forget that boldness was our founding DNA. And thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.